My name is Tom, and this is the story of what happened when my friends and I decided to go camping in the Great Smoky Mountains. We were a group of childhood friends: Rachel, Mark, Sarah, Kevin, and me. We had been planning this trip for months, looking to escape our routines and relive the enjoyable times. The excitement was palpable as we gathered in the town square, ready for our adventure in the forest. Since we were kids, we had heard stories about the guardian of the forest, an entity that, according to legend, protected the mountains but punished those who disturbed their peace. Although the stories gave us chills, we dismissed them as mere tales to scare children. However, as we got closer to our destination, a sense of unease began to grow inside me. Kevin, always the joker, tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but even he seemed a bit tense. We arrived at the campsite just before dusk. We set up our tents and lit a campfire to prepare dinner. The most superstitious member, Rachel, mentioned the guardian legends. They say it appears when you least expect it, and if it sees you smile, it takes you away forever, she said, sending a shiver down my spine. I tried to laugh off her words, but something in her tone made me feel that perhaps we shouldn't take these stories so lightly. At first, the first night in the forest was quiet. After dinner, we sat around the campfire and shared scary stories. Mark, who had always been skeptical, started to tell a story his grandfather had told him about the guardian of the forest. According to the story, the guardian was the spirit of an ancient warrior who protected the mountain and punished those who dared to defile his territory. When we finally went to sleep, I found it difficult to close my eyes. The forest creaking and wind through the trees were unsettling. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise, as if someone was walking around our campsite. I heard Rachel whispering something in her tent. She seemed as scared as I was. "Tom, did you hear that?" she whispered. "Yeah, but it's probably just an animal," I replied, trying to calm her even though I was terrified myself. At dawn, we discovered that something had changed. Mark found wooden figures hanging from the trees near our campsite, similar to those he had described in his story. These figures, made of branches and twine, seemed to watch us with invisible eyes. "This isn't a joke. Someone was here last night," said Kevin, his voice trembling a bit. I felt a knot in my stomach as I looked around. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming before, now felt full of invisible threats. After finding the wooden figures, the unease among us grew. We decided not to let fear dominate us and continued with our plan to explore our surroundings. However, as night fell, the atmosphere became even heavier. We sat around the campfire, trying to keep our spirits up with trivial conversations, but we were all alert to any strange noise in the forest. That night, the wind blew with unusual intensity, making the branches creak and the leaves whisper mysteries. Suddenly, we heard a distant scream that chilled our blood. Rachel clung to my arm, whispering that we should leave. Mark attempted to reassure us, suggesting that it might have been an animal, but his words sowed doubt in all of us. We got into our tents, but sleeping was impossible. Every little sound outside the tent seemed like a harbinger of something terrible. Around midnight, I heard a noise like someone was moving the wooden figures we had found. I stepped out of my tent, flashlight in hand, and saw Kevin outside as well, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he asked in a low voice. I nodded, and together we decided to inspect the perimeter. We didn't find anyone, but the wooden figures were now much closer to our tents. Knowing we were under observation sent a chill down my spine. The dawn brought us a temporary respite. We decided to investigate the origins of the wooden figures and try to understand who or what could be behind all of this. As we walked through the forest, we found more of these figures hanging from the trees, forming a sinister path that seemed to lead us towards the forest's heart. Sarah, normally brave, looked visibly disturbed. "This is too much. We should go back," she said, but none of us wanted to admit we were scared. We followed the trail of figures until we reached a clearing. In the center, there was a circle of stones with remnants of a recent fire. A sense of malevolence charged the air, as if it were a ritual site. Mark knelt to examine the stones, and he noticed symbols carved into them, symbols we couldn't recognize. "This isn't good," murmured Kevin, looking around nervously. Back at the campsite, the tension was palpable. Rachel insisted that we should leave before things got worse. "We're not prepared to face something like this," she said, and although her words rang true, Mark suggested we stay at least one more night to see if we could discover more. The division in the group was evident, and the uncertainty about what to do next kept us on edge. As night fell, we prepared for what we knew would be another unsettling night in the forest. The second night in the forest was even more tense than the first. We sat around the campfire, trying to stay awake and alert. The wooden figures hanging from the trees seemed to watch over us in the darkness. Sarah was especially uneasy and decided to sleep in her tent while the rest of us kept watch. We tried to reassure her, but we all knew something was wrong. Around midnight, a blood-curdling scream broke the silence. Sarah was there. We ran to her tent, but it was empty. Her belongings were there, but she was not. Rachel started crying, and Kevin tried to calm her while Mark and I searched for traces of Sarah around the campsite. We found footprints leading into the forest, but they quickly faded into the darkness. I felt a knot in my stomach, knowing that something terrible had happened to our friend. We spent the rest of the night searching for Sarah, calling out for her incessantly. The sense of surveillance grew stronger, and on multiple occasions, I believed I could see shadows shifting among the trees. By dawn, we were exhausted and desperate. There was no sign of Sarah, and the fear that the guardian of the forest had taken her became more real with each passing minute. We decided to return to the clearing where we discovered the circle of stones, hoping to find some clue to her whereabouts. Sarah's disappearance left us in a state of panic. Rachel and Kevin were on the verge of hysteria, and Mark and I tried to stay calm, though we felt the same terror inside. Back in the clearing, everything seemed darker and more sinister. The stones were still there with the same carved symbols, but now they seemed to radiate malevolent energy. While examining the site, we found Sarah's bloodied scarf near the circle of stones. The tension among us was escalating. Kevin, who had always been the most rational, began to show signs of paranoia. "This is your fault, Mark. If you hadn't insisted on staying, Sarah would be here," he shouted. Mark tried to defend himself, but the guilt and fear were too strong. Rachel, on the other hand, was convinced that the guardian of the forest was punishing us for invading his territory. "We have to leave before it's too late," she said, tears in her eyes. That night, as we tried to sleep, the whispers began. They came into focus after I thought it was the wind. They seemed to come from all directions, whispering our names in unintelligible words. Rachel huddled next to me, trembling with fear. "Do you hear them?" she asked in a low voice. I nodded, too scared to speak. The forest was alive with those whispers, and I knew that if we didn't find a way to stop them, we would soon lose our minds. The tension at the campsite was unbearable. We almost collapsed, but we knew we had to stick together. We decided to take turns keeping watch that night, though the idea of staying awake and alone in the forest was terrifying. Mark took the first shift while the rest of us tried to sleep, knowing it would be impossible. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of branches breaking and heavy breathing near our tent. I stepped out slowly and saw Mark, pale and paralyzed, pointing towards the trees. There, a few meters from us, was the dark figure of the guardian of the forest. His smile was a grimace of pure evil, and his eyes glowed with an unnatural light. I felt an indescribable terror, and we knew we couldn't face him directly. We tried to back away quietly, but Kevin, in his panic, stumbled and fell to the ground. The guardian moved quickly towards him, and at that moment, I knew we had to act. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and threw it towards the entity. Surprisingly, he recoiled as if the fire bothered him. We took advantage of the distraction to lift Kevin up and run to our tents. The Guardian's presence disappeared, but we knew he would return. That night, no one slept. Fear and adrenaline kept us awake until dawn. As the morning progressed, the tension did not diminish. We decided we needed answers and returned to the clearing with the circle of stones. While we re-examined the area, we found a small cabin hidden among the trees. The cabin seemed abandoned for a long time, with rotting wood and broken windows. We entered the cabin cautiously, and the air inside was dense and oppressive. Strange symbols and disturbing drawings covered the walls. In a corner, we found an old notebook that seemed to belong to an investigator who had been studying the Guardian of the Forest. The notes detailed the investigator's discovery that the Guardian represented the spirit of an ancient shaman, betrayed and killed by his tribe. As we read the notes, we found descriptions of failed rituals and warnings about not disturbing the Guardian. The investigator also mentioned seeing human-like figures made of branches hanging from the trees, similar to those we had found. "This is exactly what we're experiencing," said Rachel, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of here before it's too late." Suddenly, we heard noises outside the cabin. Our hearts raced as we recognized the sound of footsteps approaching. Kevin looked through a crack in the window and paled. "He's here," he whispered. "The Guardian has found us." We knew we couldn't stay in the cabin, but leaving also meant facing the entity. We braced ourselves for the worst, hoping that the investigator's notes would help us survive the night ahead. As the footsteps of the Guardian of the Forest grew closer, panic seized us. Inside the cabin, the oppression and fear were almost palpable. Mark suggested we try reciting a phrase we had found in the investigator's notebook. "It's our only chance," he said firmly. Rachel and Kevin nodded, knowing we had nothing to lose. We gathered around the notebook and began reciting the words the investigator had written. At first, nothing seemed to happen, but then an invisible force seemed to push the Guardian back. The whispers intensified and his figure wavered, but our words created a barrier that momentarily held him at bay. With this brief respite, we managed to read more of the notebook and discovered that the investigator had built the cabin to try to trap and burn the Guardian in hopes of freeing his soul. However, there were no records of whether he succeeded or where the Guardian ended up. We decided we had to leave the cabin and find Sarah, who was still missing. After following the notebook's clues, we found the stone circle again. To our horror, we found Sarah in the center, weakened and in shock. We carefully lifted her and brought her back to the campsite, knowing she needed to rest. Meanwhile, the newfound knowledge about the cabin and the investigator's attempt to imprison the Guardian filled us with unease. As Sarah rested at the campsite, we began to receive increasingly clear signs that we needed to leave the area. We discovered unsettling messages carved into the trees and wooden figures at every place we passed, all indicating we should leave. Then Mark discovered the phrase, "Leave now," written on the ground with stones and branches. But it wasn't just written messages. We also began finding small, dead animals arranged in a macabre manner as explicit warnings that we should leave. Rachel couldn't hold back her tears of fear and desperation. The presence of the Guardian of the Forest grew more intense. The whispers turned into screams, and the shadows seemed to come alive. Every time we moved, we found new, disturbing signs, this time trails of blood that seemed to guide us out of the forest. We knew we couldn't stay any longer. After Sarah regained some strength, we made the difficult decision to leave the place. We packed our things hastily, our hearts pounding and our senses on high alert for any sign of danger. The forest seemed to exhale in relief as we departed from the campsite. However, we couldn't ignore the feeling that the Guardian of the Forest still lurked in the shadows, waiting for his next victim. Although we managed to leave alive, We knew the Guardian would continue trapping unsuspecting people who ventured into his territory. The forest guarded its secrets jealously, and from that day on, we carried with us the memory of fear and the warning to never underestimate the mysteries of nature. When we reached the town, we felt a mix of relief and sadness. We had lost our innocence in those mountains, and we knew our lives would never be the same. The legends of the Guardian of the Forest would continue to be told, but now we understand the real danger he represented. It wasn't just a story to scare children, but a real warning about the boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. We decided to share our experience with the local authorities, hoping they could take measures to warn others and prevent further tragedies. However, deep down, we knew the Guardian would remain there, vigilant, protecting his territory from any intruders. We had survived, but the cost had been high. The memory of those dark days in the forest would accompany us forever, a constant reminder of the power and wrath of the unknown. I really hope you liked this tale. I am thrilled to share these stories with you. Share this video with others so that we can keep growing and more stories can reach more people. Kindly provide your thoughts and experiences in the comments section. It will aid in my further development. If you like the video, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Many thanks, and I hope to see you again soon.